Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. We're proud to partner with Leave AIM, which is an organization helping mothers facing medical crises together collaborate, which Simi Folger will tell you more about, who has been a real partner in coordinating tonight and a pleasure to work with. From OHEL, we have just launched the National Trauma Center in Florida and in New York. It's continuing and all over, where we're really expanding services to help people who are going through a trauma, as well as just also building resilience in communities and in schools and in communities in general. We have a teacher helpline, which supports teachers in schools and principals. And during the summer, we'll have it open for camps and counselors. If you want any more information about our trauma team, you could check ohelfamily.org, which I'll post in the chat box, as well as during the presentation. You're welcome to post any questions that you have in the chat box, which at the end, we'll leave some time for questions and answers. I believe Simi wanted to talk for a minute, and then Dr. Blumenthal will speak, who is the director of our trauma center at OHEL, our National Trauma Center, and he will address everyone. Okay, Simi.
Good evening, everyone. I'm so excited that this actually finally happened, Baruch Hashem. Thank you, Cheryl, for helping me coordinate this. Thank you, Dr. Blumenthal, for coming on. I'd like to give a shout out to Tova Wacholder from Aguda that set us up originally with OHEL. So thank you, Tova. I started Leave AIM when my daughter Rivki was born. She was born with a brain injury. And she currently is vented and trached, and she's in Blythedale Children's Hospital long-term care. Leave AIM provides new packages for new mothers, and we have monthly support groups in Muncie, Brooklyn, Lakewood, and trips. We provide volunteers that are trained to help with the kids, and they come to your house. They do respite with the kids, and we're adding a lot of more services. I just want to say one thing before we begin, that this is about emotional health, because I think it's very important as mothers of medically fragile children. And I want to say one thing, which I'm sure Dr. Blumenthal would agree, is that if you have feelings, don't ignore them. Feelings are real. If you're triggered by certain things, if certain things are hard, it's okay. We have to be real. I always say, I know plenty normal people that don't manage their life with healthy kids. Especially us, we have a lot more, and we have been through traumatic experiences. So just feelings are real. It's okay to feel, and we have to validate each other. So thank you, everyone, and looking forward to many more conferences and Zooms with everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Blumenthal, National Director, National Trauma Center at OHEL, Director.
Thank you. Okay, so first of all, it is a great privilege to be here. Cheryl Chernovsky, who did the introduction, reminds me of the comedian who said he's going to be rewriting his autobiography to include himself. She mentioned National Trauma. She also forgot to mention that she is also director in the National Trauma team, and recently joined us in that position, has done really a yeoman's job in our recent expansion of services. It's a pleasure to meet Ms. Folger and also to learn about Leave AIM, which I didn't know about. And I think it's, from everything I hear, it's a wonderful organization. My only complaint is that Ms. Folger's brief introduction sort of took the wind out of my sail. I think she, in a few words, said what I was going to be saying in the next 35 minutes. So maybe next time we'll let her take over for my type, for more loquacious presentations. This is an extremely important subject, and I dare say a neglected subject. The game plan is for me to speak, well, originally was for 40 minutes and then have 20 minutes of Q&A. It's probably going to be more like a half hour because it's already 7 after. So I'm going to try to address what I believe to be some of the salient issues in raising a medically fragile child. But before I do so, there's a story I'd like to share with you, which is a story I've mentioned a few times. So if some of you are repeat offenders and have heard me before, you may have heard the story already, but I think it sort of comes to my mind whenever I talk about a topic like this. And that the story is how I learned what empathy is. Many of you may know that we differentiate in English and in mental health between sympathy and empathy. Sympathy means I know you're going through a hard time, but I can't relate to it. Empathy is the capacity to sort of leave yourself and imagine yourself in somebody else's shoes. And so we're taught that this is important, and that's our goal, is to be empathic, not just sympathetic. So let me tell you what I learned what empathy really is. It goes back, and it was really a sort of, I won't say life-altering event, but it was a professionally altering event for me. It was very early in my career, and I was doing a lot of work with Holocaust survivors and their children. And the lead person in this work and in the research was a psychiatrist who was a contemporary of the survivors. Her name was Sylvia Axelrod. And the thinking at the time was that, you know, if we're treating a Holocaust survivor in a hospital or an outpatient setting, that the goal is to try to get the survivor to speak and talk about the experiences they went through. Sure enough, a nearby hospital affiliated with our hospital at that time was Long Island Jewish, now it's Northwell, had a Holocaust survivor who was psychiatrically hospitalized. So having heard our presentations, the staff were very excited, and they came to her and said, please tell us about what you went through. Please, you know, when they went through the Holocaust, please tell us. And every time they'd ask her, she said, it's nothing to talk about. It was no big deal, which was very hard for the staff to make sense out of. So they invited Dr. Axelrod to come as a consultant. And I was, again, a young person, a year or two in the field. I was what they call in Latin, I believe, the Mitschlepper. I was the sorcerer's apprentice, and I sort of came along. And the format was that the staff presented their dilemma, the consultant would interview the patient, and then they would discuss the case. So that was the plan, and Dr. Axelrod, they brought the patient out for Dr. Axelrod, and the staff presented their dilemma here, the Holocaust survivor, and every time we want to ask her about what her experience was like, she sort of poo-poos it. So they brought the patient out. Dr. Axelrod was talking to her about her hospitalization, her medication, her treatment. And at one point, Dr. Axelrod said to her, I understand that you're a survivor of the Nazi Holocaust. The woman said, yeah. So Dr. Axelrod said, I just want you to know that as an American who's never lived through anything like this, there's no way I can possibly know what that was like. And the woman started to cry and say, finally, somebody who understands. And I realized at that tender age that sometimes the most empathic thing you can say is, I don't understand. And I stand here before you in a similar vein and say that I will talk to you about my experiences, but I don't really understand. You're the experts. And I have not had the experience of raising a medically fragile child. My children are far from perfect, which is pretty surprising given the fact that I am perfect. But, you know, and I've certainly had parenting challenges, as I think every parent has. But when it comes to this specific challenge, you know best. I'm going to draw upon what I've heard from patients, from not only patients who have children who are medically fragile, but siblings also. I do want to spend some time with siblings, and what's sometimes described to me retroactively by adults who had siblings who are medically fragile, and also from my experience for several summers of traveling with the KOC, Kids of Courage group, and as their psychologist, and where I probably had the most intensive exposure to children who are medically fragile and their relationship with their parents. Obviously, the ones who had the most difficulties were the ones that were sent to me. Now, first of all, let me talk what I believe to be the progression of what happens when you first find out, when you first realize, whether it's at birth or later on, that you have a child with a severe debilitating medical condition. Usually, and this can be true of many other types of shocking realizations, usually there's incredible shock and disbelief. It's sometimes very hard just to take it in. You literally cannot hear it. And it's really, there's this profound sense of disbelief and horror. And by the way, very often initially, a feeling like I'm never going to be able to handle this, that this is really beyond my skill set, that this is something that I will never be able to handle. And as many of you by now know, that even if that was the initial feeling, that's hardly the case. But as I said, at first it's disbelief, it's trying to question it, is hoping that the diagnosis is wrong or is exaggerated, groping for miracles, a lot of this kind of more frantic, as I said, disbelief and feeling like if it is true, it's unlivable. That changes. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how that changes, because it's really one of the most amazing progressions that you'll see in people, and really shows not only the strength of man, but probably the gift from Hashem of our capacity to adjust. But one thing that I do want to address first, which I do believe to be a common, certainly early response, may linger, and that's guilt. Very often the parent, and most likely the mother, or both parents, will feel guilty and somehow or another even try to make themselves or prevail upon themselves that somehow they caused this to happen, which of course is highly unlikely. That, you know, and that guilt tends to be in these such circumstances a very intensive early response, but as I said, does tend to dissipate and sometimes even disappear. But where does this guilt come from? In fact, sometimes it's just so illogical. And certainly all those around the person, your family, your friends, all trying to convince you that they feel guilty about you couldn't have avoided it, that this is one of these fluky things. And yet the person continues to feel guilty. And so I think it's important to understand that there are, I often just tell people that there are two types of guilt. There's guilt here and there's guilt here. There's rational guilt. Rational guilt is you really did something wrong. So you may have forgotten to lock the door of your car and someone broke in and stole something and you feel guilty because of your negligence. Or you may have made a comment to someone that you thought was innocuous and really hurt their feelings, and you know better now, but you feel guilty about having caused harm to someone else. That's an easy guilt in a way. You can learn from it, you can apologize, you can do some sort of expiation if you want. That's an easier guilt. The tougher guilt is the guilt that's in the heart. The tougher guilt is the emotional guilt. The emotional guilt is based on this myth that we all cling to, that we're really running the show, that we are really in control. And as all of you know very well, that we're not. But that's a belief we don't let go of. And so therefore we were raised believing that the world is a very orderly place. Good people thrive, bad people get punished. There are always happy endings. And so somehow or another, when something doesn't work out the way you want and something doesn't work out the way you would wish it would, you feel somehow that as if you were responsible. There must be some sort of, it can't feel so random. And nothing in life is random, we know that, but it feels random. Excuse me. I'm sorry, I'm recently recovering from COVID, so I apologize. But, and so therefore we foist on this sort of senselessness, some sort of order. And we convince ourselves to believe that there must be a cause, there must be a reason. Sometimes we blame others, sometimes we blame doctors, and sometimes we'll blame who knows whom, but we very often, very quickly turn the blame on ourselves. This is just, and part of it is as well, especially as a mother, but even as a father, you know, our role. And what basically defines us is our capacity to protect our children, our capacity to make sure that our children are safe and thriving. That's our core function. And somehow or another, when that isn't the case, and when a child's well-being is compromised, we very read it's sort of, as I said, it's assault on us as parents. It makes us question our competence as parents. And that's where a lot of that guilt comes from. And it's important to know that you can't talk someone out of that guilt. That's a guilt that the person has to process, and that's part of the adjustment in terms of coming to terms with the fact that things happen that don't make sense or don't make sense to us, and there's misfortune and hardship that does occur. And our coming to terms with it requires going through a process of self-castigation or questioning oneself until one realizes at an emotional level that these things are really basically unavoidable. So then what happens after that? After this initial shock, this initial guilt, this very painful, harsh reality that somebody has to come to terms with. And then there's a progression. As I said, this is to me one of the most amazing parts of my work. In fact, sometimes people ask me how I can work so consistently with misfortune and trauma and death. And one of my answers is I don't just see the misfortune and death. I see incredible strength, incredible love. And this is no exception. There's a progression. And the progression is one where you come to take ownership of it. There's what we call in psychology an acclimation. You take this reality that is so discordant with your natural expectations, so discordant with your very natural dreams and hopes. And you sort of embrace it. You come to terms with it. You weave it into your understanding of the world, your understanding of your world. And as I said, watching it from afar, it is really an incredible gift, and it's an incredible source of strength, which I see in countless situations. That doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. Doesn't mean that it doesn't pain you. But what happens sort of is that it goes from controlling and assaulting you to your owning it, to your making it part of yourself. And this acclimation, sometimes people talk about the new normal. Other people prefer, they don't like to refer to such things as something that's normal, so they refer to it as the new reality. But it becomes part of you. It becomes part of you, and the kind of the shock and horror isn't part of your daily life. And by the way, it happens pretty quickly, and in a pretty remarkable way. Not only that, but also you become incredibly knowledgeable. I think where I find it most amazing, and I don't mean to single out any single group in our community, but I think when I find people from branches of our community that get a minimal secular education, whether it's a Hasidic community or some of the more yeshivish communities, but where people are not, where their education is very weighted in the Limmudei Kodesh and not in the sciences, and yet when they're facing this kind of medical complication, literally overnight, they become such experts and study and find out about it. It's really a remarkable process to see, and that goes to and that becomes then that new reality is true. You become really an expert, and as I said, it becomes part of your life. What typically happens then is that there will be spurts, there'll be moments where it'll sort of hit you. Sometimes out of no place, and sometimes just something will happen where the enormity of the challenge that you're facing, or the enormity of your disappointment, or how the enormity of the change in your life will sort of hit home, and then it'll happen, and there'll be hours, maybe a day, maybe a week, where some of that old shock and horror will come back to visit you. But for the most part, it's not there with you. And this is the remarkable acclimation where you see people, managing something incredible or almost insurmountable, as if it's just a normal part of their life. The sudden realization, by the way, can come sometimes. What I find is when there's those occasional breaks from having to be the 24/7 care for the child. I remember this very vividly from the trips that I took with Kids of Courage, and how much that the 10-day break meant to the parents. And sometimes, unfortunately, when we had to send the child home because they weren't acclimating or weren't doing well in the program, the disillusionment, or not disappointment, and the pain that this short break is over. But sometimes when you have a taste of just regular living without that constant responsibility, reminds you in an acute way of what you're addressing. Sometimes, by the way, also, and this is a common one that I hear about, is watching the contemporaries of your child, who may be in varying ways, depending on the medical complication, thriving and growing in a fashion that your child is, when the other children start walking, running, playing ball. And that's, if not impossible, extremely difficult for your child. If it's a cognitive issue, because children achieve greater and greater cognitive, the contemporaries of your child achieve greater and greater cognitive skills, and your child is lagging behind. And let's face it, we live in a fishbowl. We live in tight-knit, insulated communities where we all know everything about each other, and therefore it's harder to hide from those kind of comparisons. So that would be what those kind of situations where it'll sort of hit you. Now, there is a message, and sometimes I'm even going to say a pressure, that is placed upon parents with children who are failing, let's say, to thrive or have medical complications like your children. That is to try to see it as some sort of blessing, try to see it as something that's really good, fortunate, instead of as a misfortune. And sometimes that pressure really comes from inside, and sometimes it really comes from outside, where people try to convince you that, oh, this is so wonderful, and you're so fortunate, and you're so lucky. And sometimes that comes when people just don't want to have a limited tolerance for pain, not only limited tolerance for their own pain, talking about outsiders who have a limited tolerance seeing pain and struggle in others, don't want to know that this can very much be part of life. And so therefore they want to kind of prevail upon you, and they'll tell you all sorts of stories about exceptional people who are able to see the good fortune and the blessing in what looks to us more like a hardship and a burden. And some people can do it. First of all, let's backtrack for a second. We know that in some way, this is, not some way, in a way that's not always apparent to us, that this is the truth. One of our core beliefs is Kuman David Rahman al-Tavav, everything God does is good. It doesn't look good to us, but there is a hidden benefit. There is a hidden good in everything that happens, even when it's a matter of misfortune, loss, etc. So we do have this belief. But the fact that, or the capacity for us to see that, or for our capacity for us to put our finger on it and say, yeah, this is it, is not always there. And it becomes, and I'm saying this because I hear this sometimes, it becomes a pressure then. It becomes like, what's wrong with me? Why can this person celebrate the chronic illness and limitations of their child and see it as some sort of incredible blessing, and I can't? And I'm not denying that some people are capable of doing this and are capable of achieving this, but I think it's okay for a person who can't. Who, as far as they know, this is a hardship, this is a pain, this is a form of suffering, this is something that hurts them, and the good in it is hidden. And that's okay. In fact, I would venture to say, and again, maybe I'm going a little bit too far, going out on a limb, but in a way, that's a higher level of amun and bitachon. Because if I can decipher what's so good about it and celebrate it, okay, that's very nice. But if I can't, and I still believe that in a hidden way there's something good about it, that's a higher level. So I'd almost go so far as to say that those who can't experience this, seeing the, if you will, the good in what appears as painful and bad, are really, their faith is a higher faith, because they're still going ahead and saying that this is something that we know is good in a hidden way. What I would also encourage you to do, and I'm basing this on many conversations with major Talmidei Chachamim and rabbinic figures, is stay away from seeing it as a punishment. Almost any Rav that I've spoken to, when I speak about the various types of misfortune, or hear secondhand from people that I speak to, who've had the privilege to speak to many of our spiritual leaders and Rabbanim, people, they're telling people, don't look at it as a punishment. First, sometimes I say to people, how could you have been that bad? But it's really, most are going to portray a challenge like this as specific, that as a nisayim. That's what I've been told, and what I've heard secondhand, that this is not because you were bad, it's not because you did this thing wrong or that thing wrong, or previous generations being punished. It's whether it's true or not, I don't know, but most of the gedolim that I've spoken to say stay away from that, because that can lead to a sort of self-castigation or a self-denigration that will only be harmful. It's a safer place to go if you need to grapple with this religiously, is to look at it as a challenge, as an Nisayon, just like Avraham Avinu had his Nisyonos. Let me talk briefly about the impact of on the marriage and how a challenge like this can affect the marriage. And again, if what I'm saying, I think it's important to mention as well that it says in Eicha Yetz Machov K'machov Vi, is there a pain like my pain? Probably some of the things I'm saying, some of you are going to say, oh, that hits it on the nail, that's useless. All they can say, it's not me, it's not where I'm at. Everybody's situation is unique, every person is unique. And what what might be relevant and useful to one person may be irrelevant or even counterproductive to another. So anything I say, see if it fits. It's like shopping for an item of clothing, try it on, see if it fits. If it doesn't, it's not relevant to you. But I remember a number of years back, I was invited to attend a time weekend, which is a different challenge, which is couples that are struggling with infertility. And I was speaking, but I shared a thought and it was very well received. And I think it's relevant here. So I'll share it as well. I cited the very famous Rashi on Yitzhak, who was davening l'nochach ishto in juxtaposition to his wife. And Rashi explains that both Rivka and Yitzhak were praying to have a child, and Rivka was at one side corner of the tent, and Yitzhak was at the other corner of the tent, each praying in their own unique way. And so I asked the question. I said it, Mamanavshach, if you know what that means. Either sit together and pray together, or if your prayers are so different, and that's what Rashi connotes, that it's very different kind of prayers, then you stay in your tent and you stay in your tent, or you let Yitzchak go to the local minyan and let Rivka go to the women's partner minyan. I don't know, but why do they have to be in the same tent and in different corners? I mean, it's not here or there. But what I went on to explain, and I think this is important too, is that it's both shared and different as well. And I think that's what the imagery in a very powerful way captures, that a challenge like this is shared by both parents. It's a heartache for both parents. It's a challenge for both parents, but each one's going to relate to it differently. They're going to relate differently because they're different people, and relate differently because they're men and women. And then each one has their own perspective and experience. So it's an experience of both, as I said, being in the same tent, but being in different corners. And sometimes it's important to remember that it's not going to be experienced identically, that you're not going to have the identical coping mechanisms or approach. On the other hand, you're not going to be diametrically opposed either. It shouldn't be each in your own world, unrelated to the other. It's shared and it's separate as well. And I think that's applies to infertility. I think it applies to the situation of having a medically fragile child as well. And I'm going to state what I think is fairly obvious: the burden or the privilege, however you want to put it, but the responsibility, the amount of work is not going to be evenly distributed. More often than not, it falls disproportionately on the mother, sometimes just because of the demands in terms of earning of an income. And we are a fairly traditional community that still has those kind of role differentials. And therefore, it's not going to be even. It's not going to be the same. It'll be shared, but it'll also be, in some respects, disproportionate. There's also another interesting relationship that comes up in situations like that, which is your relationship with physicians and your relationship with the medical field. On the one hand, you're very dependent on the doctors, on the medical profession. On the other hand, that the more involved you are, and the more you interface with medicine, the more you're going to become aware of its shortcomings as well, and the shortcomings of the doctors. So the disappointments become more acute as well. It's not all that hard to be, it's not all that easy to be disappointed in your doctor when you see him once a year for a checkup. But when you're seeing them regularly, you're dependent on them, and you have to make phone calls, you become more acutely aware of their shortcomings. But the other thing that I think is quite amazing, and which I have witnessed, is also that you learn that the medical field is a system. The medical field has its way of operating like anybody else. And I don't mean to put down doctors. Thank God we have them. I mean, our medical care, with all its shortcomings and all the complaints, has made such incredible advancements in recent times. Our life expectancy is much longer, and there are illnesses that, infections that used to kill people, that they can be simply treated with antibiotics. So we owe a great hakaras hatov to the medical field, and then to Hashem that allowed them to progress as much as they have, but they have their shortcomings and they have their style of operating. And many of the parents in situations like this have very deftly learned how to manage the system and how to maneuver the system. And that's all part of the nisayon and the remarkable skills that you learn. One more point, and this is probably something that's probably on a lot of people's minds, and I want to spend some time on that, and my time is getting shorter, which is the siblings. the siblings of the child, the other children. And it's very interesting that I would have to say that one of the most neglected areas in mental health and in psychology is the impact that siblings have on one another. I mean, if I were to do a Google Scholar search on the impact parents have on how children turn out, there'd be millions and millions of articles. If I did a Google search on how siblings impact upon who we are, I get some articles, but not a whole lot. And sometimes sometimes it's a whole speech unto itself. And sometimes when I'm visiting a community and I'm speaking about the impact of siblings and sibling relationships, I'll ask people, let's say I have, I don't know, whatever, 100 people in the audience, and I'll say, how many of you can honestly say that your siblings had no bearing on who you are today? And usually about 3 hands go up, and they're either only children or they're late life children whose next sibling was 10, 15 years older than them, or they're children from homes that had secondary infertility and they were only children for many years until the other siblings were born. But anyone who had siblings in close age will tell you that the impact of the relationship they have with siblings, and positive and negative like anything else, is very significant and important. And certainly having a sibling, a medically fragile sibling, has tremendous impact on the siblings, and we have to be acutely aware of it. We can't sort of take for granted that they're sort of okay and or unaffected. Let's not say okay or not okay. And as I said, the vast majority are not harmed by having a sibling with a medically fragile. Most of them turn out fine and competent household adults, but there are some that it impacts them, and sometimes even impacting them negatively. And I've worked with adults who grew up in circumstances like that, who, again, they're not serial killers and they're not, lifelong patients in state psychiatric facilities, but it had an effect on them. And so, first of all, and I think this goes without saying, and I'm sure most of you understand this, we don't turn siblings into parents. We don't make them into parental figures. They help out, and that's fine, that's great, but they're not the parents. You are the parents, and by the way, that goes for the future as well. Certainly a worry and concern for many of you is what's going to be with your child when you get older and you can't take care of them as much as you do now. And that's a topic unto itself, which is probably beyond the scope of what I can talk about. But it's the siblings should feel that their relationship and connection with that child will be lifelong, but they're not going to have that responsibility. That's your responsibility as the parents. But the other thing that's very difficult, this is what I hear years later, is on those occasions when those children, when children either resent the medically compromised child, or they feel that there's a disproportionate attention or resources expended to this child. Now that's inevitable. You can't evenly distribute yourself to all your children, even without a medically fragile child. Or at different stages of raising children, certain children are going to demand more of you than others, and that's inevitable. But let's say in a situation where there isn't something so extreme, the child might resent the other kid, and it's okay for them to resent. We know that siblings sometimes resent one another, and they don't necessarily feel guilty about doing so. But when the sibling feels jealous of the sick child, or resents the sick child, or is embarrassed by the sick child, as might likely happen when, especially during their elementary school age years, where they don't want to be different, they feel very guilty about it, and they don't express it. And sometimes it leads to sort of self, disdain or self-criticism. Because how could I feel jealous or resent this child? Or how could I feel, my parents are not giving me enough, when of course they have to give to this child. So with the process, what happens is they feel resentment, they feel neglect, and they feel bad that they feel that way. They don't feel like they have the license, as they might under other circumstances, to resent another child. So it festers inside them. There's a sort of self-disdain, and that can linger into adulthood. So I think it's important that you allow your children free expression. And I think sometimes you don't overdo it, but from time to time, if you sense it, but then nobody senses children better than a parent. You sense a child is having a hard time, it's okay to ask a child, do you sometimes resent this child or that, because they get so much attention? And let them know it's okay for them to feel that way. Doesn't make them bad people, it just makes them human. And are you embarrassed? Is it hard for you to have friends over because of this child? Or do you sometimes feel neglected? It's okay. And by the way, it does behoove you, because that's the point, is that even if the sibling looks like they're doing fine and they never complain. So you think, okay, they're all right, but they don't want to complain because they feel guilty and self-conscious about complaining. And you may have to, in circumstances when so much of your time is taken up with this child, that you might have to be very deliberately portion out time for the other children. It can't be equal, but just if you make sure to carve out time and talk to them and take them out for an ice cream, throw a ball around with them, or whatever it might be, that this is important. And the impact of it often remains dormant or hidden during childhood for the reasons I just told you. And you may have to sort of either discern it or just be aware that this is a possibility. And as taxed as you are, make sure that you're giving them their fair share, their due as well. Okay, I want to just quickly wrap up. So we have time for questions. I think I'm going to very quickly say this. Be wary as well of the well-meaning, but sometimes painful thing other people will say to you. People want to take away your pain. And that's not always possible. And sometimes that leads to some awkward situations. But I also speaks to how important a group like Leave Aim is, and how important it is to make sure that part of your time is being around people who get it, people who've lived through it. Have opportunities as you do, and when you get together through this organization, to feel normal, to feel like it's that the famous Viktor Frankl line, that abnormal reaction to the abnormal situation is normal. It's a very important part of coping, and I urge you. That's why I'm so thrilled that there's an organization like this, and to take advantage of it. Nobody's experience will be identical to yours, and sometimes people will say something that just doesn't fit. But sharing or being around people that have this shared experience is priceless. There's a famous group therapist, Erwin Yalom. He wrote sort of the classic texts on group psychotherapy, and he once did a study of people who attended group psychotherapy to ask him what was most helpful about group psychotherapy, and pretty consistently the responses were, "I'm not the only one. I'm not weird. Other people feel this way as well." And that was what they found. Not some incredible insight, but that's what they found most helpful from the experience of group therapy. And I'm going to mention a study that I probably mentioned almost daily during COVID, and then conclude with a story, and we'll take the questions. But they did a study once. It's called the Steep Hill Study. They took a group of college freshmen, and we love studying college freshmen because for $10 they'll do anything. And they took them to a very steep hill, gave them a very heavy backpack, and they said, "We want you to climb this hill. But before you climb the hill, I want you to guess or estimate how hard it is." The only difference was one group climbed the hill alone, and the other one climbed the hill with a companion. And those who climbed the hill with a companion consistently rated the hill as less difficult than those who climbed it alone. And that's what you're doing here. It's the same hill, but when you climb it with others, you're not climbing it alone, and the hill doesn't look so big. And the story I want to tell you is somewhat amusing one, but I think it's also important for you to hear. The story is actually about the famous Israeli diplomat and foreign minister, Abba Eban. Most of you probably don't know who he is, they don't remember him. Some of us old timers do, but he was very eloquent. He spoke 10 languages, and a brilliant man. And the first time they built a high-rise hotel in Yerushalayim, he went on a crusade against it. He said it's spoiling the whole decor of Yerushalayim. It's the landscape. Yerushalayim is supposed to be these small buildings with Jerusalem stone and rolling hills, and now suddenly you have this huge hotel. He wrote articles. He protested, but nonetheless the hotel went up. And shortly after the hotel was completed, a reporter one day went to the roof of the hotel where there was a restaurant, and sitzt dort and Abba Eban pressing away, in the same hotel. So the reporter came over and said, "Mr. Eban, I thought you hate this place." He said, "I do. He said, so what are you doing here? He said, you kidding? This is the only place where I can't see the darn thing. Sometimes when you're in it, you can't see it. And I want you to know, and I'm saying this as someone who's outside and can see the darn thing, that you have probably no idea what remarkable kind of work you're doing, how much you have expended, how brilliantly you're attending to your child, and how much information you've acquired. And those of us who are watching can tell you that. And I think it's just important to conclude with this awareness that you are the prototypes or the exceptional parents in our community, and you deserve this credit, and you should give yourself a pat on the back from time to time as well for all that you're doing. So I see questions come in, so I'm going to allow Cheryl to sort of capture them and put them together. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Blumenthal. A lot of questions are coming in, some that came before and some that I have now. We're going to get to as many as we can. If we don't, at OHO, we're always available. I'm going to post my information, Dr. Blumenthal's information. You're welcome to email us, and we could always set up a separate time to finish this conversation together. Okay, so one question I wanted to make sure to get to that I thought here. Okay, I find pregnancy difficult, and what keeps me going is the thought that once it ends, the joy of having a tiny baby will make it all worth it. I dream of Leslie blankets, Dunas, bottles, pacifiers, and lullabies. But when my baby was born, I was told that he's a sick baby and he will spend many months in the hospital. I felt like a helium balloon flew out of my hands and was now completely out of reach. So here's my question. When I see any baby-related stuff, I feel very sad for something I thought I would get, but it's also so out of reach. How do I deal with the emotions that come along with seeing baby paraphernalia?
Wow, powerful question and a riveting question. I mean, I don't know why you wouldn't make such a fuss of a pregnancy. For us men. It's really not so painful. It's not so difficult, but okay, I had to throw that in. But at any rate, but yes, it's very, very real. And that's, it's very understandable. But here's a paradoxical response, and it's a paradoxical response, but when you have situations like that where you're confronted with pain, is don't run away from it. Stay with the pain. Stay with, when you see the paraphernalia, and it reminds you of all that you gave, and then having that crash at the end. Allow that pain in. Allow that pain. Don't, as I said, don't try to dilute it. Don't try to fight it. Embrace it. And the irony is, the more you embrace it, the more you shriek, scream, curse, whatever it takes, the less painful it'll become, and the more you'll find a way to make sense out of that. Sometimes when people make a lot of efforts and are faced with futility, one of the ways in which they cope, and it might not work for you, may not, but it refocuses us on a basic tenet of Judaism, which is our job is to make the effort, not the outcome. It's a famous line of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, Mensch darf tun, nicht darf tun. Man has to do, not accomplish. I can't think of a better example of somebody who makes a sacrifice, who puts themselves in a painful and an uncomfortable situation without the benefit of the outcome, than exactly what was described of going through the pregnancy and going through the discomfort and going through the pain, the labor pains, and then not having the thriving, healthy baby that you had been anticipating. It really speaks to that. And that might be a life's understanding or a life's profundity that one can embrace if they get in touch with that pain. So don't run away from it. It's a type of pain. You're not gonna have a psychiatric breakdown. You're not gonna fall apart. You're gonna become the more profound person from facing it. And again, I thank you for the question. It really, for me, it's a piercing question.
Okay, thank you. What's a normal response or non-normal response when you have a traumatic pregnancy or delivery and you're going on to the next pregnancy?
I'm sorry, it was a little unclear, the question.
Sorry. What's the normal or not normal response when you have a traumatic pregnancy or delivery and now you're going on to the next pregnancy to have the next child?
It's called courage. It's called incredible courage. It's a little bit like the the great one of the modern philosopher Fackenheim said about that the most courageous thing he can think of. I mean, he lived the previous generation, but it's the most courageous thing he can think of is Holocaust survivors who had children. You know, that belief in life and that belief in our mission. You know, after a trauma like that is the defining nature of courage. I'm reminded actually of, you know, I'm sure all of you or many of you have done the tunnel tours in Israel where you tour the whole, you know, as close as we can get to the base of Migdash and, you know, underneath the whole area. And, you know, I remember once standing there, I think it was the second time I read that, I was taking one of my kids, and the guide we were looking down in this glass that was going all the way down. He said, the first level is this, you know, is the Ottoman area, and the second level is Bayesheni. And if you look all the way down, you can see remnants from Bayis Rishon. And then he quoted from the L'Chadodi, we build on destruction. We build on disappointment, and that's what going on and being pregnant again. But and I think this is important to know for yourself and for your spouse to know. It's what defines us, but it's also very courageous.
Okay, thank you. Another, wow, I see more coming in. So again, whatever we don't get to, we'll definitely be in touch after tonight. Can you speak to the role of stigma and embarrassment or shame on part of parents, grandparents when you have a child?
Right. So yeah, that's unfortunately part of life. And I think it speaks back to what I mentioned earlier in terms of guilt, that somehow or another, we cling to this belief that we're sort of calling the shots, that we're running the world, which all of you know very well we're not. But the stigma stems, I think, from a belief, well, if you don't have the picture perfect family, there's something wrong with you. And we so know that's not the case. Whether we're talking about medical ailments, whether we're talking about emotional difficulties, adjustment difficulties, it's, you know, there's so much that goes into what happens that really are beyond our control. But I will tell you, in terms of stigma and potentially, well, let's say, stigmatizing type of remarks, and sometimes it has to do, but sometimes the antidote to that is your attitude, is how you conduct, how you hold your head up high, despite the fact that you have these difficulties and challenges, how much you impart to those around us, that you don't feel any less a person because this happened to you. You may feel more burdened, you might feel more exhausted, you might feel more challenged, but your self-worth has no bearing on, I mean, it's not in any way compromised or diminished by what happened. And when you impart that, that's the best answer to what might be people who look at you as askance or try to sort of look at you as if you've done something wrong because this happened to you.
Okay, this question I think you addressed a little bit, but read it. I also find it hard to look at pictures of the time my baby was in the hospital because I feel I'm reliving it. Even pictures that were taken in the park make me relive the pain that my baby is missing from all those family pictures. Should I try to block out that time in my life, or is there a way to deal with it?
Well, first of all, you can block out things in your life. There's nothing wrong with that. There's no halacha that you have to face everything. Some things are very painful, and some things are, as my mother would say in Latin, besser nicht wissen. She told me it was Latin. I don't know. It's probably why I failed the Latin teachings. But we don't have, if there's something you're going to look at that might hurt, but also, expand you, might prompt you to understand things better and grow and cope better, then it's okay if it hurts. But if something is just pure pain and doesn't benefit you in any way, you have enough, you're dealing with enough. Don't force yourself to relive parts of your life that at this juncture are not in any way beneficial. Hashem gave us a capacity to forget. And if Hashem wanted us to remember everything, he would have not created us in such a way to forget. And some things we should forget.
Okay, this just is coming up in many different forms of questions. So I'm gonna ask this, maybe we could spend a few minutes on this. Can you ask here regarding anxiety about having another child, if your child will be healthy before and after and during the pregnancy? Again, you started to address this before, but just having a tremendous amount of anxiety while pregnant seems to be a challenge among many.
Right, right. And that's probably inevitable. Now I'm going to put aside whether there was indeed something, let's say genetic or something that you found out that it's actually a reality that there's a risk of having another medically compromised child. Let's put that aside for a second. Let's say it's one of those kind of things that nobody can explain or understand, and your odds of having a healthy child the next pregnancy are the same as everybody else's, and yet you have this anxiety. It's a sort of a little bit of a double-edged sword, and I'll explain to you why. Anxiety can impact on the child. An anxious parent that anxiety does pass through the placenta, and it's not always ideal to be pregnant when you're anxious. On the other hand, a moderate amount of anxiety is not going to do any harm, and it's very natural to have that sort of misgiving and fear. And the way you overcome that is by facing the frightening experience again. So in other words, it's like the old line, if you get thrown off a horse, you get right back in the saddle. And if pregnancy has become a source of anxiety for you, the solution is to re-enter the pregnancy and see that you're like everybody else, and your odds of having a healthy child are the same as anyone else's. So I think it's really a judgment call. If I would tell you that if the anxiety is pronounced, wait a little bit. If again with a heter, obviously, but wait a little bit. Wait till you've gained that, till you've made that transition to the point where you have mastery over the situation, where it isn't as disheartening as it is now. So maybe might be an argument not to rush into the next pregnancy if you're still kind of reeling from what was just happened. But if you're at that stage, which happens pretty quickly, where you have it under control and you understand, at least rationally, that you're the same statistics as anyone else, and the anxiety is not as pronounced, then that might be a time to take the chance and reclaim your sense of being a normal, nurturing mother, which would be also ultimately healing as well. I'll share with you the experience I had, which I think has some, unless there are too many other questions, should I end here?
You could share, I'll just touch on one thing and then you'll share the experience.
Sorry, but okay, I see I only have 5 minutes left. So.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I see a lot of questions coming in about siblings and homes, which you already touched on. So I would say with those, if you have individual questions, then let's address those on the side and feel free to reach out to us. The other one that I saw come in is someone who is having just with shortages in terms of, and maybe Simi could speak to this afterwards with here. I'll read it. My wife and I are from the more organized couples. Between having 2 medically challenged children, we have managed to be on top of dealing with the supplies, companies, doctors, appointments, nursing agencies, but with everything going on globally with the various shortages, it is becoming overwhelming to just try and keep up in a timely fashion. What is there to do? What do you suggest and advise?
I think Simi can talk about it more at a practical level.
Right.
I will say one thing is that this is, again, the strength of communal belonging and belonging to others, because if there are ways to get the supplies, or if there are methods to do it that are effective, those in the similar situation or those connected to different members of the community, that's the beauty of living in our community, can sometimes, I think, remedy those solutions. But again, on a more pragmatic level, I'm not in a position to speak to that.
Okay, so she'll get back to that. And I think that really summarizes a lot of the questions. I know there was one last story. I didn't mean to stop you before. I just wanted to make sure we touched on it.
It was related to what I was going to tell before. I once had to do a debriefing for Hatzalah drivers who unfortunately were unable to save the person that they were trying to save. And I did my usual bag of tricks with them. And then afterwards, there was one guy who was actually a physician, so was the most knowledgeable. And he said, okay, let's chazer. And he fired questions at them, like rapid fire questions related to the particular tragedy. And they shot back answers, and And I was watching it and I was saying, like, why are they doing this? And then it dawned on me, they're reclaiming their sense of competence. They're reminding themselves, even though they weren't successful here, that they know what they're doing. And I think when along the lines of the question of having more children or facing pregnancy again, it's sometimes a reclaiming of your competence, of your normalcy, of your capacity to bear and have healthy children, and that can be an important part of the healing process. But again, done when you're ready, and when you have your current challenge on as much as possible under control.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Blumenthal. We are going to end here. I'm going to post my email in the chat, and Dr. Blumenthal will post his. You could feel free
You post my email address, sure.
to follow up with any further questions that come up. Simi, any?
I just want to say thank you, and you spoke, and Dr. Blumenthal, you spoke so. I just, exactly what we needed to hear. I mean, at least I felt like that. Thank you so much. And if anyone has any questions, please reach out to me. I'll forward it to them. And regarding the supply shortages, we have to work on some kind of gamach globally, or at least here, and we have to talk about that. But again, thank you so much for everyone for coming on. And thank you, Cheryl. Thank you, Dr. Blumenthal. And
Sure. Okay.
have a healthy, beautiful summer, everyone.
Okay, you too. Thank you.
Thank you.